Welcome back for another deep dive. This time, we're going deep on those rivalries that have shaped the South Sydney Rabbitohs. We've got this great article here, and it breaks down some of the biggest grudge matches in the club's history.
Hmm.
And wow, there's a lot to go through here. I mean, the Rabbitohs are one of Rugby League's oldest and most successful clubs, right? And so they've had over a century to make some enemies. I'm thinking these clashes probably tell us a lot about the club itself, don't you think?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, you can think about rivalries as these threads woven through a club's history.
Hmm.
They can tell you so much about the club's identity. And in the Rabbitohs case, their rivalries are really tied to the social fabric of Sydney. Makes them even more interesting, I think.
Okay, so where do we even begin? We're talking decades of history here.
Well, you got to start with the rivalry that practically defines Australian rugby league. Rabbitohs versus the Roosters goes all the way back to 1908 when both clubs were founded. It's been a powder keg ever since.
Yeah. I was reading that this rivalry goes way beyond just wanting to win. It's kind of like a clash of cultures, isn't it?
Exactly. The Rabbitohs come from the working class areas of Sydney, representing areas like Redfern. And the Roosters, on the other hand, well, they were formerly eastern suburbs and they were associated with the wealthier, more coastal areas. So it wasn't just about who was the better team, it was about which part of Sydney you were from, what your values were, almost like a microcosm of Sydney's social divisions playing out on the field.
Wow. So the rivalry really tapped into something much bigger than just sports. Do you think that's maybe why it became so intense?
Oh, I think that's a huge part of it, yeah. These cultural differences showed up in the way fans supported their teams, the type of players that each club attracted, even in the styles of play that they were known for.
So fascinating how those social dynamics can end up, bleeding into sports.
Yeah.
How did this clash actually play out over the years? Any specific moments that really capture what this rivalry was all about?
Oh, countless examples. You could look at the 1935 match, where the Roosters just destroyed the Rabbitohs with a record-breaking score of 87-7.
Oh, wow.
Can you imagine the bragging rights after that game?
I can't even imagine a score like that.
Yeah.
That must have made the rivalry even more intense.
Oh, it definitely didn't help. But then you've also got the Rabbitohs' golden era in the 1950s and 60s. They won 6 premierships during that time, and they often dominated the Roosters, like a total reversal of fortune.
So it wasn't always so one-sided. It's interesting that even when the Rabbitohs got kicked out of the league in '99, they came back in 2002, and who was their first game against? The Roosters. It's almost like it was meant to be.
Remarkable, isn't it?
Yeah.
Seems like almost every defining moment in the Rabbitohs' history involves the Roosters in some way. And of course, there's the 2013 preliminary final where the Roosters snatched victory from South Sydney, denying them a grand final appearance.
Right. I remember hearing about that. Must have been heartbreaking for Rabbitohs fans, which makes their 2014 grand final win. Well, let's just say, we'll get to that a bit later.
Yeah.
Before we move on, though, I'm curious. You mentioned how this Roosters-Rabbitohs rivalry was all based on this class clash.
Mm-hmm.
Did that ever lead to any, let's say, less than sportsmanlike conduct between the teams?
Well, let's just say that those early games were played at a very different time.
Yeah.
The rivalry was fierce and the physicality on the field could be brutal. But even today, you'll hear stories from older fans about brawls in the stands, and there's definitely still an edge to their encounters.
That makes sense. Okay, so we've got the Roosters, the ultimate rivals. But the article mentions another major rivalry for the Rabbitohs, the Canterbury-Bankstown Bulldogs.
Ah, yes, the Bulldogs. This one's different. It's not as rooted in history as the Roosters rivalry is, but the intensity, the bad blood is off the charts.
Yeah, and it seems like the Bulldogs bring a massive and very passionate fan base to the rivalry, too. I'm imagining that just makes things even more intense.
Absolutely. Both clubs draw huge crowds, and their games feel less like games and more like big events.
Mhm.
The atmosphere is electric. There's this underlying tension you can feel in the air.
So the article really highlighted the 1967 Grand Final as a key moment in this rivalry. Why that game in particular?
Well, that grand final was known for being brutal, even for that era. It really showed the no-holds-barred approach that these two clubs brought to their rivalry. And for South Sydney fans, it really cemented their image as this tough, uncompromising team that wouldn't back down from anyone, even under pressure.
So we're talking about a clash of styles, personalities even, all on top of just the normal competitive fire.
Right.
I could see how things could get out of hand.
And they did, many times. But maybe the most infamous incident that really fueled this rivalry was a Sonny Bill Williams walkout in 2007. Williams was a superstar for the Bulldogs, and then he suddenly walked out in the middle of the season to play in France, it just devastated the Bulldogs and their fans.
And then, of course, to make matters worse, he ends up signing with Mavericks. Yep, you guessed it. The Rabbitohs. I bet that didn't go over well with the Bulldogs fans.
Oh, it was like throwing gasoline on a bonfire. Instantly became a symbol of how bitter the rivalry was and the perceived betrayal between the two clubs.
And I'm assuming all this leads into that 2014 grand final that we keep hinting at.
It absolutely does. That grand final is a result of years of tension, frustration, animosity. But we'll get to that in a bit. First, we need to talk about two other rivalries that, while they might not be as exclusive, still say a lot about who the Rabbitohs are.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's next on our rivalry tour?
Let's talk about the St. George Illawarra Dragons. Now, this rivalry is fascinating because it's less about, I don't know, animosity and more about a shared sense of history and identity.
And shared history. In what way?
Well, South Sydney and St. George were both dominant forces in the mid-20th century, and both came from working-class backgrounds, so there's this feeling of kinship, of understanding each other's struggles and triumphs, even while they're competing fiercely on the field.
So it's less like, a bitter rivalry and more like a family squabble.
Yeah. They're rivals, but there's this underlying respect, even affection, you could say.
That's really interesting. Any particular moments that stand out to you when you think about this rivalry?
Well, the 1965 Grand Final comes to mind. It drew over 78,000 fans. That was a record-breaking crowd at the time. Shows you how much these two clubs really captivated the city.
Wow, that's incredible. What an atmosphere that must have been.
Electric. But even more recently, the Dragons and the Rabbitohs have had some great games, like the 2018 semifinal. Went down to the wire, South Sydney winning by a single point thanks to a last-minute field goal.
Oh, wow. Talk about a nail-biter. Okay, so we've got the Roosters, the Bulldogs, the Dragons. Who else is on the Rabbitohs hit list?
Last but not least, the Manly Warringah Sea Eagles. This one's a real cultural clash.
How so?
Well, on the one hand, you've got working-class South Sydney representing the inner city, and then you've got Manly, which is from the more affluent northern beaches. Two different worlds.
So it's city versus suburbs, blue collar versus, well, let's just say a different kind of lifestyle.
Exactly. And that difference is reflected in their fan bases, the players they attract, even their styles of play.
So it's not just about who wins and loses. It's about what each team represents. Any particular games stand out in this rivalry?
The 1951 Grand Final's a good one. South Sydney just demolished Manly, won by a huge margin, showed their dominance at the time, and highlighted the gap between the two clubs.
Ouch. That must have been tough for Manly fans. But I imagine they've had their moments of revenge over them.
Oh, absolutely. Look at the 2013 preliminary final. Manly had this stunning comeback victory against South Sydney, crushed their hopes of reaching the grand final.
Oh, man. That's tough. Seems like the Rabbitohs have a history of dramatic clashes with just about everybody.
Well, it comes with the territory of being one of the oldest and most successful clubs in the league. You're going to make some enemies along the way.
That's for sure. Okay, so we've laid the groundwork, explored these four big rivalries. But I've got to know more about that 2014 grand final. What role did these rivals play?
Well, that's where things get interesting. But we'll have to save that story for part 2.
All right, I've been waiting to hear about this 2014 grand final. You've been building this up as this ultimate clash, this epic showdown where all these rivalries come together. So what happened?
Well, remember those 4 big rivalries: Roosters, Bulldogs, Dragons, and the Sea Eagles. They all kind of set the stage for this amazing moment.
Okay, so which one ended up playing the Rabbitohs in the final?
It was the Bulldogs, the same team that Sonny Bill Williams walked out on to go play in France. And then he ended up with the Rabbitohs. Talk about dramatic.
Wow, all that history, all that bad blood, and it all comes down to this one game. Must have been a lot of pressure.
Oh, the tension was unreal. The history between these two clubs, the whole Sonny Bill Williams thing, just made it even crazier. And on top of all that, this was the Rabbitohs' first grand final in over 40 years. It felt like fate.
That stadium must have been absolutely buzzing.
Oh, man, it was beyond buzzing. Deafening. The energy was so intense and you could feel the passion from both sides. It was a real battle. The whole game went back and forth.
But in the end, the Rabbitohs won.
They did. They won 30-6, ending a 43-year premiership drought. It wasn't just a win, though. It was like this huge release for the Rabbitohs and their fans. Decades of, waiting and frustration, and then bam, this incredible victory.
I can only imagine.
Yeah.
Especially beating a team like the Bulldogs with all that history.
Pure ecstasy for South Sydney, and I'm sure it felt like sweet revenge for a lot of their fans, especially those who still remember the Sonny Bill Williams thing. But for the Bulldogs, all right. Let's just say it probably made things even worse between them.
That's what rivalries are all about, right? They never really go away. Every game is a new chapter in the story.
You got it. And that 2014 grand final for the Rabbitohs, it wasn't just a win, it was a statement. Like they were saying, hey, we're back and we're here to stay.
And they did it by beating some of their toughest rivals.
Yeah.
It's like something out of a movie. But what about the other teams, the other rivals we talked about? Did they play a part in all this?
Well, they weren't in the grand final itself, but they definitely helped make the Rabbitohs who they were at that point. Like the Roosters, for example, they were always there, right? Like this measuring stick that the Rabbitohs had to overcome.
Right, like the final boss they had to beat to prove themselves.
Exactly. And then you've got the Dragons. That rivalry is all about shared history and respect, right? Less about hate and more about who's the best of the best.
Like a test of strength between brothers.
And then there's the Seagulls, the city versus the suburbs thing. Overcoming that rivalry must have given the Rabbitohs a lot of pride, you know? Like they were representing their community on the biggest stage.
So each rivalry had its own role to play. Like they all helped shape the Rabbitohs into the team that won that grand final.
Couldn't have said it better myself. They faced all these challenges, all these tests, and they came out stronger.
All thanks to their rivals. You know, I'm starting to see what you said. You have to understand the rivalries to understand the Rabbitohs. It's not just about the wins and losses. It's about the journey, all the obstacles they overcame, you know, finding their identity through it all.
That's it. These rivalries aren't just side stories. They're part of what makes the Rabbitohs who they are. They've shaped everything. Their character, how they play, even their relationship with their fans. It's a story of resilience, determination, and in the end, triumph.
It's wild to think something like a rivalry can have such a big impact, but I have one more question before we wrap up this part. Why should our listener care about all of this? I mean, especially if they're not a Rabbitohs fan.
That's a great question. You know what's beautiful about these rivalries, about the Rabbitohs story in general? It's about more than just rugby. It's about the human spirit, overcoming adversity. It's about the power of community and passion.
You're so right. It's something anyone can relate to. It doesn't matter if you follow rugby or not.
Yeah. Exactly. Think about it. We all face challenges in life, right? We all have rivals or competitors in some form or another. The Rabbitohs story, it reminds us that even when things get tough, even when you're up against impossible odds, you can still rise above it all. You can achieve great things.
It's a story of hope and never giving up on your dreams.
And that's definitely a message worth sharing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've covered the rivalries, seen how they all led to that historic 2014 grand final win. What's next? What final insights do we have for our listeners? You know, it's really amazing when you think about it, how just a sports rivalry can teach us so much about history and culture and just the human spirit in general.
It really is. These rivalries go way beyond the field. It's like they give you a look into a community's soul, you know,
Yeah.
their values, their struggles, their triumphs.
Yeah, but for the Rabbitohs, those rivalries show a club that's really connected to its history, that's faced tough times and come out stronger. A club that never gives up.
Exactly. They were kicked out of the league, written off by so many people, and yet they came back, driven by that desire to prove themselves, to honor their history.
And all while battling these fierce rivals, these teams that pushed them to their absolute limits, tested their will. It's like those rivals were the fire that made them into champions.
I like that. A good analogy. Like the rivalries gave them that grit, the determination, the will to win, and that's what got them to that 2014 grand final victory.
And it's incredible how those rivalries, going back over 100 years, shaped not just the Rabbitohs, but the whole landscape of rugby league in Australia.
Yeah, you're right. And you know, it's really interesting. We've been talking about these rivalries like they're all separate things, but they're all connected. They fed off each other, creating this whole web of history and emotion, a fire that's really unique to the Rabbitohs.
Like each rivalry is a thread in the tapestry of the club's identity.
Exactly. And when you take a step back and look at it all, you see those rivalries made the Rabbitohs who they are today. Resilient, proud, fiercely competitive, and with this unbreakable bond with their fans.
This goes way beyond sports, though, right? It's
Yeah.
about community, belonging, finding strength in tough times.
Absolutely. I think everyone can connect with that. Doesn't matter if you're a diehard sports fan or not. It's that human need to belong, to overcome challenges, to achieve something bigger than yourself.
So as we finish up this deep dive, what's the one thing you want our listeners to think about? The message we want them to take away from all of this?
Think about this. What rivalries have shaped your own life? What competitors or challenges or obstacles pushed you to become who you are today?
Because just like with the Rabbitohs, those rivalries, those tough times, they can help you grow, make you more resilient, help you discover what you're truly capable of.
That's a great way to put it. It's about seeing those tough times not as something to be afraid of, but as a chance to learn and grow and come out stronger.
And who knows? Maybe those rivals, those battles you faced, they've shaped your own personal journey too. Made your story just as interesting as the South Sydney Rabbitohs. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.